Welcome to this evening's virtual book club. I'm Robert Newman, President and Director of the National Humanities Center, and your host for this evening's event. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to log in so you can participate in the discussion. You can do that by clicking on the blue sign in button in the upper right-hand corner of the page and entering a Gmail account. Tonight's conversation is the second in our current three-part series, Talking with Scholars about the ongoing struggle to realize our founders' vision of a country dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. Our guest this evening is David Bromwich, who began his career as a literary scholar at Princeton in 1977, before joining the English department at Yale University, where he is currently Sterling Professor of English. Professor Bromwich is the author or editor of over a dozen books dealing with the work and thought of Romantic era critics and poets, 18th century politics, moral philosophy, and other topics. But he's also built an international reputation as an incisive public intellectual. David Bromwich's essays and reviews touching on cultural as well as political topics have appeared in the New Republic, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and other journals. And he's a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post's political blogs. He has been described as an elegant American muse, and he's been praised as a daring and knowledgeable critic, willing to challenge received opinions and orthodoxies. David's work has earned him widespread recognition, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And it's been our great good fortune to have him as a trustee of the National Humanities Center since 2017. This evening, we've asked him to talk with us about his recent book, American Breakdown: The Trump Years and How They Befell Us, and his analysis of the dynamics that have produced our current political climate on the eve of a historic election. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Bromwich.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that introduction. I actually like conversation in theory and try to practice it in consequence. So my intention is to talk for about half an hour. I'll perhaps do a bit of reading from the book to give people who are listening some sense of it. And then maybe Robert and I will go into dialogue for a few minutes and then take questions that come up from people who are watching. Unfortunately, the title of this book, American Breakdown, was not hard to arrive at. There's, I think, a movie of that title. There may be one or two other things by that title, but it seemed to fit the predicament one felt oneself in the years when I was writing the bulk of these articles, which are separable chapters or essays, but come together in the book, about half of which, or the slightly larger half of which, deals with the administration of Donald Trump and a little bit with the previous career of Trump. But I want to start with the real, as I see it, originating point of the troubles we are in for this breakdown. And I would set it in 2001 and at the reaction to the September 11th attack on New York and Washington, the reaction to it, rather than the attack itself, though it was the worst suffered by America on American land, the only thing to compare it to being Pearl Harbor. But I should say one could go back a step further to be honest about this reckoning, and say that things really began not to make sense for America's understanding of itself and of its place in the world around 1990, when there was a mood of general celebration, not only in the United States, but in Europe, about the fall of the Soviet communist system and the Soviet Empire. something that owed a great deal to the conversations between and negotiations between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik. Reagan wanted to go farther than his advisors let him in disarmament, for example, of nuclear weapons, and Gorbachev would have been the person to do it with. But the United States response to that opening was completely, as I think we can see looking back, completely lacking in magnanimity. The reaction was to press Russia further as if it were still a foreign policy adversary, even though it was no longer communist and no longer ambitious in that way at all, by the expansion of NATO eastward, an alliance that had been constructed entirely for the purpose of defending Europe and North America against the Russian Empire, which no longer existed. And it came out also in the nostrums of what was then called economic shock therapy to give Russians the benefit of big money capitalism about which America was riding high in those years. And a great many economists, mainstream economists, and people with a respectable reputation on the liberal side, such as Jeffrey Sachs, participated in this movement of economic shock therapy for Russia's benefit, but also for the benefit of big money in the West. And so looking back, there have been commentators who noticed this as a lost chance, as a road not taken that we can really lament in retrospect. I'm thinking of critics of the policy such as Jack Matlock and the late William Polk. But on the whole, there's been very little self-scrutiny, very little national self-inquest about how badly and how selfishly the administration of George H.W. Bush Sr., and of Bill Clinton treated the opportunity opened by the fall of the Russian Empire and the end of Soviet communism. So I wanted to put that in at the start because it may lead to things further on in the discussion. Now that roles are reversed and it is not so much the Republican Party as the Democratic Party that wants to restart a major adversarial stance in the world against, I suppose, Russia most of all. But the large event that we can trace as a response and now know to have been a deeply misjudged response to the attack on the US in 2001 was the Iraq War launched by the Bush-Cheney administration. And this was almost a foregone policy, the Iraq War. It was the fruit of thinking done before the United States had been attacked in 2001. You can track its origins to such documents as a pamphlet called Rebuilding America's Defenses, published in the year 2000, in which it was by a group of scholars connected to the American Enterprise Institute and the Project for a New American Century, in which it was stated that the United States couldn't properly dominate the new unipolar world in which we would rule through force of arms, but also force of ideas and goods. But we would only rule if military force projection were allowed. And that wouldn't happen. We wouldn't properly build up our defenses unless we were attacked. In the absence, as the famous words of that document said, in the absence of some catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, the new Pearl Harbor came a little more than a year later, and a group of very well prepared policy advisors, including Stephen Hadley, Douglas Feith, Stephen Cambone, Paul Wolfowitz, and others, some of these names will be recognizable, some not, came in very closely associated to the Vice President, Dick Cheney, and prepared for war against Iraq. That preparation began in a speech Dick Cheney gave at the Veterans of Foreign War meeting in the summer of 2002, but the ginning up of the war is an experience many of us of sufficient years can remember quite well. It was made to seem inevitable, and the case for deposing the, in fact, internationally non-threatening tyrant, Saddam Hussein, the case for restarting the Middle East, for shaking things up, for shaking the kaleidoscope, as Tony Blair put it, and changing the nature of the world at that moment. Again, the arrogance of a figure of speech like that, shaking the kaleidoscope. But it was thought by the US, by its leaders at that time, by its policy strategists, and by their counterparts in Britain that this was a proper role to play and that Iran would be a good place to start it. Sorry, I said Iran and I meant Iraq. So let's get that straight from the start. Iran will come in a bit later. Cheney's role in this shift of policy from what was thought to have been a hefty, muscular defense by the greatest power in the world to an offensive policy, an aggressive policy to show our strength in the world. Cheney was the leader of that, the recruiter of other talents, and his power in the Cheney-Bush years from 2001 through 2006, right till almost the end, I think is impossible to underrate. He was placed virtually in charge of all things military, of domestic and foreign policy, of natural resources and energy policy, and of nominations and appointments. And George W. Bush, the younger, famously said, "When you talk to Dick Cheney, you're talking to me." We now know that the Iraq War was based on a forgery, or rather more than one forgery. The prepared finding of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq never happened. There was talk of a special stash of enriched uranium that could be found in Niger, also false. There were reports that made no sense to anyone who knew the region that Saddam Hussein had sent out agents to convoke a special meeting with Al-Qaeda. But in fact, Saddam Hussein was entirely opposed to Al-Qaeda, who were a danger to him much more nearly than to the United States. And one reason he acted imprudently in making gestures of resistance to weapons inspection was that he didn't believe America would be so stupid as to attack him, as to attack this bulwark against Al-Qaeda, which we had genuine reason to fear because Osama bin Laden had launched the September 11th attack. So the war was begun March 18th, 2003, and was brought, the optimistic president believed, to an end when he held his mission accomplished rally on an aircraft carrier a few weeks later on May 1st. But of course, the war wasn't over yet. It turned into a civil war in Iraq with a large assassinations campaign going on in Baghdad, depriving that country of a great deal of the middle-class professionalism and expertise it needed in order to build itself up and to become a part of the world of nations at a higher level than it had been before. All that was lost. The country was not what to say, entirely destroyed, but for instance, the water and electrical systems so weakened that it took years to put them back halfway operational again. That's the great event and the great, what to say, shortfall, the disappointment of the Bush years. And it's a queer thing. Sometimes accident plays an amazing part in history, and I actually believe it did in this case, though I don't think it's something I ever mentioned quite in this way in print. I do think George W. Bush believed himself to be avenging his father's honor, and at the same time reaching beyond his father's achievement by finally getting rid of the tyrant that in the first Gulf War the elder Bush had left in place. And there was an unsuccessful assassination attempt that could be tracked back to the Middle East on the life of George H.W. Bush. And the younger Bush wanted to get back at them for that too. So you have this Shakespearean plot going almost of a son wanting to up the stakes and prove himself better than his father. And that entirely irrational element, I think, can't be omitted from the many factors that contributed to the folly and the catastrophe for Iraq, even more than for America, of that war. And the younger Bush, as far as I can tell, is feeling remorse about it these days. You can see it in the weekly bicycle rides he takes with paraplegics from the war. You can see it in the heroic biography he ended up writing about his father. You can see it in the decorous silence he has preserved about subsequent politics. He is the least active and the least vocal of ex-presidents that there has been in memory, perhaps since Eisenhower. That's a digression, but maybe of some interest. The war was saved, that is to say, kept on the map, that is, kept alive war, which we didn't have to say we lost, by the surge planned by Frederick Kagan and General Jack Keane and put into execution by Bush in 2007. But that only prolonged the war. And meanwhile, of course, the war in Afghanistan, which had begun as a hunt for Osama bin Laden, was grinding on and on and on, as it now has for 18 years. Important to remember that the two Democrats who were serious aspirants to the presidency in the Bush years, namely John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, both as senators voted for the Iraq war and yet gave signals to their followers and anyone who could read between the lines that they didn't altogether believe in it. That's a terribly weak position for people close to the leadership of a major party to be giving, but it's pretty typical of the way opposition parties have worked in the face of war in the United States throughout our history. So the two parties are moving closer together in other ways as the candidacy of Barack Obama gets into high gear in 2008. Obama is having regular conversations on the tarmac as he moves from one city to another campaigning with Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, who was formerly head of Goldman Sachs. And one of the most fateful decisions of the Obama presidency, which really took place before he became president, was the appointment of his economic team, led by a group out of the Goldman Sachs circle, very similar to Paulson, headed by Lawrence Summers and Timothy Geithner, associates of Robert Rubin, who had been, of course, in a similar position in the Bill Clinton administration. So this idea that the two parties aren't seriously opposed to each other in foreign policy, and they aren't seriously opposed to each other in the sort of economic advice they're getting, both Bill Clinton, the younger Bush, and then Barack Obama in 2009, all three, have moved Wall Street into the White House as a way of feeling secure about the economy. And you get an economy that's based on stocks and the activities of big banks, and it leads to the abuses that we came to know when we learned about complex derivatives, mortgage default swaps, and the other abuses that led to the real estate bubble blowing up in 2007, 2008, and then the financial collapse, which was the inheritance the Obama administration began with after he succeeded to Bush. I suppose the easiest way to formulate the popular causes of the turn against the Democrats that led to the surprise of Donald Trump being elected in his contest with Hillary Clinton is to say that from the start, Obama, with these advisors, had underrated the impact, the really catastrophic impact in the economy and in the lives of many, many people of that financial collapse, from which the government helped the banks and the larger industries, such as the automobile industry, to recover. Bailouts for the banks, but a much slowed down and much less efficacious program for people to keep their houses, which were being closed down by underwater mortgages. Obama's way of talking about this in the second and third years of his government was to speak of headwinds. We're still getting headwinds that are buffeting us a bit in this economy, but the sense was of recovery always on the way. And yet it was recovery that never quite came for a great many Americans in what we now call the Rust Belt or flyover country, or otherwise known as, during election time, the battleground states. Obama also had campaigned on the foreign policy of rejecting the Iraq War as a wrong investment of American military power, but accepting the Afghanistan war, as a necessary one. And he was trapped by this. He had chances to get out of Afghanistan from especially a set of memoranda sent to the State Department and read by Obama, and possibly available for public use by an ambassador there. But these were not used. The Afghanistan project was felt to be an inevitable commitment of the United States. And the reasons for staying there, though it's been nowhere near as damaging a policy to the country or to the United States prestige in the world, are very similar to the reasons for staying in Vietnam. We couldn't afford to lose face. We somehow couldn't afford to have a war that we said we'd lost by just pulling out. It seems to me that the Republicans, with Cheney very much behind them, attacking Obama in the early months of administration, felt that they had him on the run when they saw his intention to stay in Afghanistan, and when they heard such announcements as he made in his National Archives speech on May 21st, 2009. That was where he conceded that he thought the United States would have to keep a category of permanent prisoners who were too dangerous to be let go, but who, since they had been tortured, could not be tried because the evidence would be inadmissible. It's where he canceled his intention to print a second set of photographs of things the US had done in Abu Ghraib and other prison camps, abuses of the Iraq War. And I think the Republicans, at that time, War Party, felt they had him on the run also, when, for example, he tried to announce his intention to free some of the Uyghur prisoners completely without crime from Guantanamo. And Congressman Frank Wolf of Virginia said he wouldn't take them in his district. And then Obama went back on his intention to release them. There was a lot of indication of timidity in those early months, stepping forward and then under any kind of attack, stepping back. Another example was the announcement that there would be a civilian trial for Khalil Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the September 11th attack. And then when Senator Lindsey Graham and Mayor Mike Bloomberg attacked that, said, you can't do that, Nor, it's too scary, it'll disrupt the city, Obama and his Attorney General Eric Holder pulled back. It was similar in jobs policy and nitty-gritty of economic recovery. Obama had spoken early of how many jobs, on the pattern of perhaps the Civilian Conservation Corps under FDR, would be shovel ready within months of his taking office. But by his second year in office, he was joking about the phrase shovel ready. He spoke about what he called a pivot to jobs so often that it became a subject of ridicule in stand-up comedy. So what were the achievements of that administration? I think preeminently the Affordable Care Act and the Iran nuclear deal. But even with those, there were drawbacks, there were pitfalls whose nature and scope became clear only at a later date. Obama came to his commitment on healthcare rather late and arbitrarily in ways people don't always entirely understand. He and the insiders in that administration, his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, and others weren't sure what their big policy should be, what their signature policy should be in early weeks. And they held discussions in which, in effect, with the help of focus groups, they threw against the wall two ideas. One was climate disruption. Let's do something big about climate change. And the other was healthcare. And healthcare was the more popular, so they decided on that. But it involved an enormous delay, thanks to Obama's pressing desire, an almost a compulsion with him to prove himself bipartisan and get some Republicans to vote for it. So a long wait was induced, partly from this cause and from routing it through 5 committees of Congress, rather than trying to map out the policy in its main outlines, at least, in the White House. In the end, no Republican voted for that healthcare policy, and there were other obstructions or mistakes made on the way. In the 3.5 years between arriving at the policy and rolling it out in that computer availability that emerged in early 2013, Obama had held only one conference with his appointed head of the new healthcare program, Kathleen Sebelius, once in 3.5 years. And this suggests a habit of delegating rather than deciding, and a distance from policy by the president who is executing it. That's very unusual, and at the same time, temperamentally much in keeping with what we know about Obama. His second term was a bit, it stumbled on that, because that was in the earliest weeks of the term. And he was also confronted by what was then called the Arab Spring, and the question how to respond to it. And the delayed response of the administration under persuasion from Hillary Clinton in 2011, I should say, I'm stepping back a little, but the policy continues into the second term, was to put together a United Nations coalition to depose Muammar Gaddafi, the despotic leader of Libya. And the Libyan war was, as it were, an Iraq war in small, nowhere near as many killed, nowhere near as much destruction, but it set a migration in motion across the Mediterranean that really horribly expanded the extent of the disaster in the greater Middle East, and led eventually to slave markets being reinvented in Libya. So Obama's second term was under a burden, partly self-made and partly made for him by the Republican majority that began to gather at the first midterm election in 2010, and that, you know, gained momentum as time went on, from going from the Senate to Congress. Nevertheless, and I should mention one other element that Obama had to contest against, and that is the Tea Party, this populist right-wing movement, pretty well funded, but nevertheless with a lot of, as we came to call them, angry white men, angry white people, and other people on the ground, going from city to city, and not disrupting things tremendously, but showing that they felt something about the country was going wrong, and they were going to say so. These people, on the whole, were anti-tax, but they were also anti-immigration, and to some extent, they were people disappointed with the results of the wars who did not know what to do with their disappointment. Can't cover everything, and I will say nothing, as I had intended to do, about the National Security Administration, Edward Snowden, and those conflicts, where, again, Republican and Democratic responses were not as differentiated as you might have thought. So in walks Donald Trump, a complete outsider to both parties, who had contributed, in fact, in his career as a businessman, more money to Democratic candidates than to Republicans, and who in the 1990s had wondered whether he might not want to run for president, and said he guessed he would have to run as a Democrat. Trump, however, took a great interest in the birther campaign against Obama. That sort of tabloid fascination has always been part of him. And he was rated very low by his Republican and Democratic opponents when he walked into the primaries in 2015, and even after he took the nomination in 2016. Hillary Clinton felt that the comeback of the economy would clinch her victory pretty conveniently. It was inconceivable to her and her advisors, and the polls made it seem inconceivable too, that someone as unsuitable and unqualified as Trump would carry the day and actually be able to be elected president against a popular vote margin of more than 2 million, but getting plenty of the electoral votes he needed. A friend of mine talking to me after, I think it was the first debate between Trump and Clinton, where it emerged, as you would expect, that Clinton had a great deal of competence for government and Trump didn't know what a president would need to know. But nevertheless, she said, this friend, that no matter how relatively incoherent Trump sounded, and no matter how masterly Clinton's presentation of her knowledge of policies, there were issues on which Trump had a kind of slogan that addressed a grievance, specific grievance, of a sort that you couldn't possibly extract from the number of position-taking statements that Clinton made. And the three areas of policy were immigration, jobs for Americans, and getting out of the wars. And on all of those, Donald Trump said things that would not only be sympathetic to the Tea Party constituency, but to a great many other Americans. People wanted to know where the limits would be drawn on immigration because there was a fear of defending one's own jobs against lower paid people who will take any work. Then there was the desire to get back what our industrial base had lost over the preceding several decades, going back to Jimmy Carter's administration. And there was exhaustion with the wars and very little patriotic fire left in the sort of people who would have rooted for the wars earlier. So that's the wave Trump rode in on. And you know, I had planned to give a summary of his years in office, but I think I'll run through that very fast and just read a couple of passages from the book and then go into discussion. Trump was attacked by anticipation in a most unusual way, and it still looks unusual to me in retrospect. And that was happened a few days before his inauguration, when the three heads of intelligence, James Comey at the FBI, John Brennan at the CIA, and James Clapper at the the head of national defense, approached Trump with revelations from what we now know as the Steele dossier, and told him that he might be in some danger and he should just know about this danger. Think about what it would be to be Trump looking at these guys and receiving this information, which they say has lots of rumors about you, some of them perhaps true, and we just want you to be ready. We want you to know how to defend yourself. And of course, they were also saying you better rely on us. The response of Trump to that approach by the intelligence community, which the right in America now calls the deep state, was to fire James Comey. And that led to the appointment of Robert Mueller and the instigation of the Mueller inquiry. But as everybody now knows, the Mueller inquiry fizzled in a sense. It led to the finding that there had been lots of contacts between Donald Trump and Russians, but no established coordination or conspiracy, that there had been clear evidence of what could be called contempt of Congress, but that Trump, even though he had wanted Mueller to be fired, hadn't gotten him fired. So what to say, the motive had been worse than any action that took place. Nevertheless, Trump's missteps led to a further prosecution of him of a more literal sort in the impeachment after his phone call to Ukraine, where he seemed to promise that the delay of an arms shipment would no longer obtain, that the shipment would be released if only the Ukrainian president would assure him that investigation of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden would be performed. So that was one of the impeachment charges. And again, plenty of evidence of bad intent, but a bad action not quite carried out convincingly, and the Republican Party stood firm with only Mitt Romney voting for one of the impeachment charges. And then we've had the COVID crisis, which the Democratic Party has chosen to blame entirely on Trump, and Trump feels himself to be largely innocent of. It's a kind of bad miracle that has dropped out of the air. I think what anyone would have to say more impartially about his response to COVID is that it has been deeply irresponsible and chaotic in a manner that marks the man and marks his presidency. But how to work against it in the light of the kind of following he gathered from the preceding administrations and American bewilderment about our place in the world, how to proceed against the Trump presidency has never been quite clear, and the Democrats have struggled with that. It isn't clear that there's any one party, one movement, or one kind of policy that has a popular mandate at this moment. Let me read just one passage from the introductory chapter of the book, and then I'll stop. This is from the end of the introduction. Though impeachment, and I wrote this book a little before the impeachment occurred, would seem to be the constitutional solution, it may be that only a rejection of Trump by a strong majority in 2020 could begin to reverse the degeneration that he personified as a symptom even before he hastened the process by his official acts. The loyal Tea Party remnant have been so thoroughly imposed on that they would take impeachment as proof of a conspiracy against Trump. They have been coached to believe that every finding of the Mueller inquiry is part of an organized attempt to nullify the election of 2016. Foreign policy, I add, always limits what can be done in domestic policy. And it is mad at this point for the United States to have a foreign policy toward every country in the world. This fact about foreign policy is most the case for a nation immersed in multiple wars of choice. Whether we speak of them or not, and they're way off the headlines now, they are a drain on civic imagination and public energy, to say nothing of the loss of lives. Nationalism of the sort Trump seemed to represent in his campaign might at least have led to a greater concentration on the repair and reform of American society and the improvement of justice at home. But the most dire hazard of the corporate plunder undertaken by the Trump administration can be seen in defunding and staff reductions in places like the National Weather Service, located in the Department of Commerce, the Food and Drug Regulation in the Department of Agriculture, and control of nuclear waste in the Department of Energy. The greatest war we face for many generations to come will be defensive in nature. Climate disruption stands as the overwhelming collective danger that the distraction of the Trump years has tempted us to ignore. And those who concentrate all their passions against Trump are captive to his denial as much as those who are genuinely ignorant. Global climate disruption is already a cause of effects we still speak of as if they belong to separate categories: immigration, inequality, war. There will be wars as a consequence of climate disruption. There will be mass migrations, and there will be increased inequality. Meeting the change that is on us will require a form of international control we haven't begun to imagine. Trump did more than anyone else to create a national distemper that has postponed for a few years longer a reckoning with the future of life on Earth. More than cheating an election or insulting traditional allies or degrading the norms of public speech in unheard of ways, his denial of the existence of this more than national predicament should be counted as the largest of his crimes. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, David. I want to begin with a question. Trump's presidency is referred to so much as a kind of outlaw presidency and a norm buster. But you assert in the book, and you point out, that Obama is very much a kind of precursor to Trump, particularly in the power of celebrity, and the ability to galvanize a kind of magnetized attention. So, is Trump's presidency really that unprecedented? Or is it more a kind of normalization or reflection of certain new tendencies in American manners and in the American media? And what might those tendencies be?
Good question. Well, Obama was a rock star, as his admirers call him, and he was a great campaigner. And he cut a great figure. Personally, there's a kind of magnetism many people feel about him, and a glamour that reminded some of JFK. And the media certainly were friendly to him, and he spent more time getting interviewed, getting friendly interviews, being even on comedy shows, being interviewed for whole hours at a time on late night talk shows. I mean, that kind of thing, which Obama did engage in, what was unprecedented. And he was a publicity-oriented president and an image-oriented president in a way that outdid Bill Clinton, outdid certainly the older Bush, but the younger as well. But there was one very important normal thing that went on as before under Obama, and that is to say the business of government was mostly being pursued by people qualified to do the business. Places like the Department of Commerce, places like the Department of Agriculture, places like the Department of State were fully staffed, and people were doing tasks that the president was the ultimate decider on. But there was a machinery, there was a respectable bureaucracy of government, if we can combine that adjective and that noun, that was very much in line with precedent. And of course, Obama's way of talking was rather vague, it was rather over dignified, it was too lofty much of the time, but it was polite, it was refined, it was at the very least unobjectionable, and he was very good at projecting sympathy, especially sympathy to people who were in need. For instance, the party acted almost as a grief counselor after the many mass shootings that happened during the Obama years. So there's a kind of human feeling there and a kind of, corporate and governmental efficiency that continues and is even, the Obama years are, I would say, a distinct improvement on its predecessors in many of those respects. Trump breaks with all of that. Let me name just one fact about manners that I think captures it. Because of the medium that he is most engaged with and to which he owes a great deal of his popularity, namely Twitter, social media, Trump has recurrently attacked individual American citizens, people of some importance, people who are part of the opposing party, people in the media, but sometimes just ordinary citizens when he's disgusted by a statement that's been made against him. Everything is personal to him. And he, the chief magistrate of the most powerful country in the world, goes after individual citizens in this intemperate, this almost insensate way. So that's a matter, if you will, of manners, not of law. There's nothing illegal about what he does. We don't have any precedents for it. But I think the temper, or what I call the distemper that it has fomented in the country, it is without precedent. But it's a regrettable fact that though completely different people were captivated by Obama and by Bush, they both owe a tremendous lot and have been tolerated even for their faults because of their value as celebrities. And I think this has not been true of all presidents. I mean, in fact, if you go back, I think it's only really John Kennedy and FDR in the 20th century who had anything of that quality. And one could argue that they didn't work as hard at celebrity as Obama did, and they didn't live for it minute for minute, looking at TV, looking at Twitter, seeing if he's mentioned the way Donald Trump does. So he's a bad example of a new kind.
One of our viewers asked that you say something about the implications of Cheney and Bush's foreign policy for domestic policy, whether there may not have also been domestic policy reasons for their foreign policy actions. And she cites in particular the alacrity with which the Patriot Act was formulated and passed.
Well, there's no doubt that I don't know about Bush. I don't credit George W. Bush with ideas, but Cheney had very pronounced ideas about the executive power that the president should be able to command, and he's as extreme an anti-libertarian, and if you will, a constitution-breaking leader as America has ever known. And it is a scary fact about our recent past. He wielded more power than anyone since Franklin Roosevelt, I believe, and with more potent effects on the country and on the future of the country. The weird thing about the Patriot Act, I have tremendous admiration for Russ Feingold, the one senator who voted against it, 98-1. The Patriot Act was rolled out a few weeks after the attack of September 11th, and it had obviously been in waiting. It was a ready for action document. They hadn't struggled to write it and written it very fast and produced something modest but necessary. It was a full-fledged piece of domestic repression. And I have no doubt that Cheney, going all the way back to his work, not so much as Secretary of Defense for George H.W. Bush, but his work as a congressman and as a defender of Ronald Reagan's actions in Iran-Contra, that Cheney had a fascination with executive power and a desire to expand it. So in that sense, expanding the presidency, there was a motive that the Iraq War cooperated with very neatly. But no, I hate to say anything in extenuation or of Cheney's role in that administration. He wanted it's a matter of fact, I think, about the earliest days of discussion of these matters, that Cheney wanted the Iraq War less than Bush did. Bush was telling people from the first days of the government, get all you can on Saddam Hussein. I'm very interested in Iraq. But for Cheney, yeah, it was a pretext. But if by domestic policy we mean such things as health care, low-income housing, improvement of the infrastructure, and so on and so on. I don't think that Cheney had a stance on any of that that's particularly possible to differentiate from the general Republican stance, which is, it was even in those years the trickle-down Reagan economics and the idea that corporate profits will eventually profit everyone. I don't think he had much interest in domestic policy, and this comes out in odd ways. After the Katrina hurricane and the disaster, the flooding, the displacement of people that followed, Bush asked him to lead a commission. Was going to go down and investigate and decide what the proper measures of recovery and reparations were for New Orleans, and Cheney point blank refused. He just said, I won't do it. It's not interesting. And so great was his status in the Bush administration that Bush just took that and appointed someone else.
Another viewer asked you, mentions that you talk in the book about the growing lawlessness or contempt for the rule of law since the Vietnam War and its aftermath, and asks what potential correctives or remedies do you see?
Well, I think rioters have to be prosecuted, and I think millionaires have to be prosecuted when they abuse their power by wrong investments of people's pensions. And one of my regrets about the roads not taken in the Obama administration was that he did not make a point of actually prosecuting some of the war criminals of Iraq and Guantanamo, and actually prosecuting some of the financial criminals of Wall Street. But there's a pathetic moment of testimony before the one of the House Finance Committees by Eric Holder, in which Holder confessed that he believed that the great structures, the money firms and the banks, were too big to fail. And he said, "This is not good for democracy. I recognize it, but it will be a terrible distraction for us, and it's a fight we just don't have the resources to take on." Well, it would have taken tremendous courage and initiative, stamina for Obama to prove he cared about the rule of law by prosecuting war criminals and bank criminals. But that would have been good. It seems to me that the rule of law, to us who've lived long enough in America, has a somewhat different sound than law and order. Law and order means lots of policing and lots of people in jail, and lots of people are bound to be criminals, and let's get them all. The rule of law means we're all the same. We all have to, if we want to object to a law, find ways of objecting to it or suffer the penalty by conscientious objection, but care about the common good in that way and show your care for it in the common in the usual ways. The kind of lawlessness that we're seeing now, on the one hand, in such events as the plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan and its precursor, those demonstrations in the Michigan state capitol. And on the other hand, the 100 days plus of rioting and arson in Portland by largely left-wing crowds. I mean, these are very unhappy omens. And I think that people like the Democratic mayors who aren't saying enough against their rioters, their nightly rioters, and people like the Republican legislatures that aren't saying enough against their vigilante militia demonstrators, are culpable in a much worse way even than Obama and Holder for not upholding the rule of law by their words and by their actions.
Another viewer asked if Trump's election speaks to a prevailing anti-intellectualism in America.
Yes, 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 and yes. It is an extraordinarily anti-intellectual country, and he is the most. I mean, I don't want to. I can't get into the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN habit of finding new language for denouncing Trump. He is a crazy man, and he is a bad man. But what are you going to say? He does not put coherent policies together. He's a source of incoherence, even where he might have done some good in his own political interests. There was no reason for us to abandon the missile treaties with Russia, given Trump's desire to have better relations with Russia for whatever reason. Of course, we all know the reason. He's in debt to Russian businessmen because they're the ones who are buying his apartments. But, so many false trails. That was anti-intellectual too. The Democrats restarting the Cold War stuff about Russia as an adversary and acting as if there had been a military attempt to have a coup against the United States by destroying our elections. No, no, no. They didn't think Trump was going to win, and they did not make a major effort. But no, the anti-intellectualism of Trump, it's not, anti-intellectualism sounds like a commitment. It's just complete absence of mind in the usual sense. But yes, that is a long American tradition. And the exceptions to it, even in the presidency, are so few that we're absurdly grateful for them. People are, I think, absurdly grateful for Obama for speaking like a president of a university. Okay, but if like me, you've met plenty of university presidents, we shouldn't value it that much. But yeah, a civilized tone was set. Or Jimmy Carter, who got his from the Navy, but we like that a lot, and we have other examples that are multiple. If you listen to the hearings, for example, of that I was listening to partly today of Amy Coney Barrett, she's an academic and a thoughtful and reasoning kind of person, though not my legal politics. But why not have a few more people like that who are not just Supreme Court judges, but senators? We don't have very many. And here I am fulminating. There's nothing to say about it except this is us. This is America.
So another of our viewers wants to return to the question of Afghanistan, and worries about the possible return to power of the Taliban, and suggests that maybe we shouldn't abandon it and create a power vacuum.
You can say that about many countries in the world, but we have more than 700 bases throughout the world, and we've put billions, is it trillions of dollars into Afghanistan by now, most of it corrupt and going to heroin interests and so on. So yes, bad things can happen in the world when the United States pulls out, and bad things seem to happen when we go in too. So it does not seem to me that our role should be to be the force for order in a unipolar world. We're going to have to develop far more self-dependency, ability to manufacture our own goods, repair our infrastructure so people can travel, develop a modest kind of prosperity for a far larger number of Americans. And this may not be compatible with, saving our Enlightenment ideals from the encroachment of the Taliban. What the Taliban did in Afghanistan was far less damaging in deaths and in corruption than what the United States and the opponents we conjured into being, such as ISIS, have done in that whole region.
You say in your book that the job of a decent politician is to appeal to the interests of the people without feeding their prejudices. So is there a shred of decency left in politicians? Can we find them? Or has that decency been entirely jettisoned now?
No, of course there are decent politicians. In the COVID crisis, though he made mistakes too, I think the way that was conducted with the explanations performed in public by Governor Andrew Cuomo was admirable. He let people know what was happening day by day, let them know why it was happening, and so on. And there are, senators who exemplify this kind of decency and, if you will, civic virtue as well. Sherrod Brown, I think of as one. And I will give I would say one should credit Mitt Romney with a certain amount of courage, being the one person who voted as he did on a difficult occasion. Maybe decency and intelligence and some idea of policy direction, all three combined, are rather hard to arrive at. But I think there are people like that among our lawmakers. There just aren't enough of them. I mean, this goes back to a comment Tocqueville makes in his book on American democracy. He says, when you travel around enough and talk to people in this country, you talk about the 1830s, but I think it's still true, you see that there are many great talents and great energies in the country. But he says it happens in America. They just aren't in politics. If it's any comfort to think that this French observer believed that as early as 1830, maybe we should take comfort from it.
So I want to conclude by asking a question from a quote from toward the conclusion of your book, where you say, "Can we recover a rational skepticism regarding the state and corporate institutions, and at the same time acknowledge the value of a representative government with three functioning branches? For constitutional democracy to survive, this doubt and this fidelity must be made to coexist again." So can you give us some hope that we could accomplish this?
I should say I'm not yet living up to the practice I'm about to preach, though my wife does more than I do. And I would say that local government, city government, state legislatures are an important place to work from the ground up, rather than concentrating in this manic episodic way on the presidency every 4 years. And of course, our presidential campaigns last 2 years. There's almost only 2 years of a presidency anymore, because there's such a spectacular and media driven fascination with just that. So it does seem to me, I mean, when I've talked to, for example, our local selectmen, I'm dealing with a very intelligent person who knows a great deal about the interests of the neighborhood and the town I live in. And I think that kind of investment performed by more Americans, that kind of civic involvement, could gradually, by reverberations, by more than a ripple effect, lead to good effects in national government too. But it's the star system of the presidency and the people who magnetize the attention of the media. I think that's one of the great weaknesses that has kept on enlarging itself, at least in my lifetime, and that I think we're going to have to shrink it, as we're going to have to shrink the dream of governing the world by this country, if we're going to make sense of the crisis I talked about in the little passage I read, that is to say, the international crisis of how to have a habitable planet to live on.
Thank you, David Bromwich, and thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. I want to thank the sponsors of our virtual book club series, Duke University, the Federation of State Humanities Councils, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, the Research Triangle Park Foundation, the Furman Humanities Center, and Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes at Arizona State University, Duke, Furman, North Carolina State University, the University of Michigan, and listeners like you. This evening's event has been recorded and will be available here on the National Humanities Center YouTube channel. Please click the subscribe button and the notify bell to be notified of future discussions and other videos from the center. You may also visit nationalhumanitycenter.org to learn more about the center's work and other opportunities to explore the humanities. Please join us in 2 weeks, October the 28th, Wednesday evening, when our author will be Andrew Delbanco. Good evening, everyone. Stay well.